Hey, now that my mute is off.
And we are recording at this time. We're going to wait for a few more folks to show up. But for those of us who are joining us at this time, we have on the line with us right now Mr. Hank Weisinger. Hank is the son, Mort Weisinger, who was the editor at DC Comics for Superman back during the Silver Age. A lot of the stuff that Superman fans love today, Supergirl, Crypto, the Bottle City of Kandor, the Phantom Zone, the Legion of Superheroes. Hank's dad is the man who was responsible for all this. This is the man that helped to bring all about the Superman mythos throughout the 50s and 60s. Also, he was the man who came up with the idea for the imaginary stories, which probably led to some of the best DC comics throughout the 60s, in my personal opinion. These are stories like what if Lex Luthor killed Superman? Or what if Superman became Superman Red, Superman Blue? And these are stories today as some of the best written of the Silver Age. And we are very honored to have Hank with us. And Hank, I was just going to say, we've got a nice little audience building, folks coming and talking with you. Oh, Hank, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I hear you fine.
Okay, cool. Now, I was going to say, I was getting, checking some internet connection here to make sure everything's fine. So, and looks like everything is good. Now, I was going to say, we're close enough to start time, so how about we go and get started?
Fine by me.
Awesome. Well, we were talking a little bit the other day about your dad, and one of the things about your dad is there's not a lot of information out there about him. And like I said, a lot of the guys who worked at DC Comics at the time and everything, there's just not a lot of personal information about them out there. I was going to ask if you could tell us a little bit about your dad's background, where he came from, and if you can tell us what got him into science. He was one of the first science fiction fans. He's like one of the guys who really helped start early science fiction fandom back in the 20s and 30s. And I was going to ask about your dad's background and what got him into the genre.
Well, he grew up in New Jersey, and I would say my grandparents at one point were fairly affluent, and then lost everything in the Depression. And as my father tells me, he got an illness on his feet one time, and he had to stay in bed for a year. And so he tells me, who knows whether it actually happened, but he did tell me he read the entire book of knowledge when he was in bed for a year, and he got very interested in science. And his mother wanted him to be a doctor, but that wasn't really his interest. He actually had a friend who wrote sold a story, a magazine article. And that's what really motivated. My father basically used, I would call it social comparison. He said, if this guy can sell an article and make easy money, then I can do the same. And that's how he got into writing. And his first interest, and then he did write something, sold it, and he bought his first typewriter, which I actually still have. It's like an Underwood typewriter. A lot of Superman stories were typed on it.
Wow.
And then he became interested in science fiction, and he was a childhood friend of Julie Schwartz, who I'm sure everybody knows that name. And they started a science fiction magazine for fans. And he used that. He was really went beyond that. He started corresponding with a lot of the famous science fiction writers of the day, and he got them to write articles and in short stories and then he became an agent. And he started selling their stories rather than just printing them himself. And science fiction was really his first love. He didn't really like, he liked the knowledge of science, but he didn't really want to apply it except in his imagination. One of the things he really contributed to Superman was that scientific explanations of many things, you know, is why Superman has powers from the red sun, you know, from an orange sun instead of a red sun, and so on. And then the more he got into science fiction, you know, and he kept contact. He, as you know, he brought a lot of these science fiction writers into doing Superman. He always had great confidence in them. Ed Hamilton, Otto Binder, these were really good people compared to what he felt the writing talent of many of the just straight Superman, you know, writers, which caused him a lot of stress. So then he went into the army, and he was writing a lot of magazine articles. A lot of people don't know that. They think of him just in terms of Superman. He wrote about 3,000 magazine articles for things like Reader's Digest, Collier's, cover articles, Saturday Evening Post, and so on. So when he was in the army, they made him a cook. So he wrote an article called "I Was a Rookie Cookie," and they sent him to work in public relations at Yale, where he worked on Stars and Stripes with Glenn Miller. Yeah, Bill Holden, William Holden was his roommate, Broadway Crawford, and so on. And naturally, as the years went by, you know, 30 years later, when I can assure you many of these people forgot who my father was, but anytime we saw a movie with one of these characters in it or Highway Patrol, I'd have to hear, you know, the 20-minute story, his recollections of how he was friends with these people and yada, yada, yada. And then when he came out of the army, he went back to Superman. And then the rest was history. As he started to get more and more power in the Superman you know, organization, he started taking control. He was an idea machine, and that is really why he could not be stopped. There will never be an editor at DC that has that much power ever again. That's one of the things I think that DC learned when you know, he was gone. Never to give one person so much authority, because he did use it.
Well, the thing is, your dad, in my opinion, was able to use it to a good advantage. Like I said, the comic book industry, when the 1950s, for folks who aren't familiar with it, by 1954, you had Senate investigations. You had people that were wanting to shut down the industry. They thought comic books were corrupting kids. They thought they were a bad influence. For folks who don't know about The Seduction of the Innocent, it was a book written by Dr. Frederick Wareham. And Wareham wrote about how comic books cause juvenile delinquency, because every juvenile.
You know, my father. Yeah,
go ahead.
When my father debated with him, so when he made that comment that juvenile delinquents read Superman, my father's response was, "Yeah, they also drink milk."
Yeah, that's the thing Wareham didn't get, is that every juvenile delinquent in America read comic books, but every straight A student in America read comic books. Every Boy Scout read comic books. It's like saying every juvenile delinquent watches television. It's like every kid watches television or goes on the internet. It's just one of those things where I think he just didn't see the big picture, that comic books appealed to all children. But
correct.
I know
children is the appropriate phrase, because my father used to tell me that 60 million 8-year-olds were his boss.
Well, we talked about that the other day, about how that attitude has changed a lot with a lot of writers and editors today who seem to think they have no obligation to the customer. And I always appreciated that about your dad, is that he was always thinking in terms of entertaining the kids who read the comics. And I think that's one of the things that made the books survive, whereas other comics didn't, is I think it was because he used his authority and used his power wisely to make Superman it was the best selling time as far as superheroes went. And that's one of the reasons I think DC survived, whereas other comic book companies went under. As far as superheroes, I mean, you had Timely eventually becoming Marvel Comics, but there's a reason why the Captain America books weren't published throughout the 1950s or Submariner. It took time for them to come back. But Superman has that wonderful run that's gone from 1938 to the present day, and probably the most recent thing with the COVID-19 was probably the only thing that's really caused a disruption in publishing any of the Superman comic books.
Right. I mean, I can assure you, if he was still doing it, he would have stories about that, of how Superman has to stop the virus.
Well, I didn't want to address that idea that you were talking about the way your dad thought. He was writing these for the kids, and we had that wonderful conversation where you were talking about the Metropolis mailbag, where he was getting his ideas from the kids who were writing in, and so that's what was generating a lot of the ideas. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I would say that was really the source for creating the Superman mythology. Kids would ask questions, and then he would have to come up with the answers. He'd make them up, and then they would be incorporated into the Superman lore. And I get, as an example, dear editor, where does Superman keep his clothes, his Clark Kent clothes, when he changes? And then he said, oh, he's got a pouch in the back of his cape. But he didn't think of having a pouch before that question was asked. So a lot of the questions would stimulate him to the answers. Then would help develop the mythology. For example, how come when his rocket crashed or something, or how come when he uses his X-ray vision, it doesn't break his glasses or whatever? And then the answer, of course, because Mark Kent made his glasses out of the window that was in his rocket from Krypton, so it became, invulnerable. So they have things like that. One of the most famous, there was a story, do you remember, called the Great Boo Boo Contest, where they put errors in, and the contest was who could find the most mistakes. Do you remember that story?
I remember that one, yes. Mm-hmm.
And the kids who won it was a bunch of kids from MIT. They actually found mistakes that my father didn't even realize he had put in. And one of them said, dear editor, you say Superman could fly faster than the speed of light, but according to Professor Einstein's theory of relativity, that is impossible. Please explain. So his response was, what Einstein says is theory, Superman's speed is fact.
That's awesome. Well, I did want to ask also, we were talking a little bit that you actually got a chance to give some input into your dad's comics also. You said that your dad would often ask you about ideas and covers and such, right?
Every morning, I didn't have an alarm clock for school. He would walk into my room, shaving cream on his face, and every single morning, for years and years and years, his first thing to me was, how's this for a cover? And the rule of thumb was, or he'd tell me a story, if I could guess the ending, he'd throw it out.
Wow. You also told me a great story about how if you came up with an idea and they wanted to credit it to a kid, you would actually use your friends' names in the comic books, or they were like.
Oh yeah, that would be a big thing. Whenever he wanted to, make up a letter, he would sign one of my friends' name, and it would be a big thrill for them to see their name in a Superman comic.
Well, I was going to ask when.
I mean, this is how he discovered Jimmy Shooter. Everybody knows his name.
Oh yeah.
He gets a letter, an idea. My father was so impressed with it. He sent the guy. He said, "I'm going to buy this, $25, and if you have anything else, send it to me." And then the next thing he got from Jim was not just an idea, but actually the artwork. He did the whole thing. And when my father saw that, he didn't really know. He was just a kid. He invited him to New York for a summer job with his mother came. And that was the beginning of how Jim Shooter got into DC Comics.
I was going to say
The other great talent that he discovered like that was a guy named Cary Bates. You know that name?
yes. I'm actually Carrie is the guy that actually got me into wanting to write comic books when I was a kid.
Right.
Because I loved his run on the Flash and Superman
Yeah,
comics also.
he was very talented,
No, I was
Cary
just going
Bates.
to say I was going to ask about that because I was going to ask about Carrie because I remember he got started by pitching ideas for covers for the Superman covers. In fact, I think the first one he did was the one with Luthor and Brainiac, where Superman's been shrunk down to size in the birdcage.
An interesting story about Brainiac. My father comes home and he shows me a letter from a computer company that says you can no longer use Brainiac because we had the copyright, for their computer company. So the way my father resolved that is he turned Brainiac into a computer.
Interesting, because I remember the first couple of appearances, it seemed like he was more humanoid than robot.
Right. That's the only reason he was a computer, to avoid a lawsuit.
Awesome. I never realized that. I remember the appearance changed. I remember they made him more. It seemed like they made him a little bit more robotic looking in the comics.
Right.
Yeah, that's
Right.
awesome. Well, I was going to ask about some of the characters and situations that your dad helped to develop for the Superman comic books. How some of these characters came about. I guess starting with, say, Crypto. I can imagine there were a lot of kids wondering, why does Superman have a dog?
Right. We used to have a big German Shepherd that lived in the house behind us, and the dog would always get through the hedges. And my father did not like the dog. He was not a dog lover, but he knew that kids liked dogs, and that's why they needed Crypto. And he did a lot of Crypto became very popular. Now, one time I will tell you, the owner of DC Comics at the time, the national periodicals, Jack Leibowitz, one of them, was a big Cleveland Indian fan. So he had season tickets for the Yankee games that were about 8 rows behind the visiting team's dugout, which was great for me because I went to all these Yankee games and had great seats. So one time, and there were 4 seats in the box. So one time, my father and I there, and there are these 2 other people there, at the time, considering the cultural context, you would not see Hispanics in those seats. So my father was wondering, how did they get these seats? Somebody obviously gave them the tickets, and it was a father and his son who was basically my age, maybe like 10 years old. So when my father started talking about Superman to the 10-year-old, and he said, "Who's your favorite character?" And the kid kept saying Crypto. And it took my father about 3 innings to figure out that the kid meant Crypto. That's how he was pronouncing him, and that became sort of like a joke between us.
Wow. Well, I was gonna say, I know as a kid, like I said, I remember having my first dog when I was a kid and loving it, and I remember being disappointed
right, but once Superman, then it became kids would ride into Supergirl habitat, and therefore the birth of Streaky or Common came into play.
Yeah. Well, eventually you had like the Legion of Super Pets, which was basically all the Superman animals, and then Chameleon Boy's shape-shifting pet.
Mm-hmm.
Which I do have to ask how the Super Monkey came about. About the Super Monkey.
That I do not remember. I can't help you there.
No problem. No, I always
might have been something that was sent in a rocket ship or something from Krypton. Like I think Jor-El was an early version or something, or sent up a rocket, and I think that's how Super Monkey came out.
Well, no, I used to kid with people. It's like, Batman's cool and Batman can do this, but Batman never had a pet monkey. Superman had a pet monkey, so that's what makes Superman cool, in my opinion. Well, now speaking of baseball, you sent me some wonderful artwork, and when we post this on Facebook, we're going to share the artwork that Hank sent us. He sent us some beautiful covers, original covers from his dad's collection, and also a wonderful baseball piece that I'd like you to tell everybody about, the Mickey Mantle story.
Well, I was a big Yankee fan, and actually, Mickey Mantle replaced me, became my hero more than Superman. And as I mentioned, we had season tickets, and I had read in the paper that they were going to have a Mickey Mantle Day, September 10th. So I had my father, I said, I want those 4 tickets. So he had also, he was also, besides running Superman, he was also the VP. He ran public relations for DC. Like when George Reeves was on Lucy, that was my father arranged that. When he was, do you remember the show Masquerade?
I've heard of it. I've never seen it, but I've heard of it. Yeah.
Masquerade was like on a Sunday night where they would have somebody come out and they'd be in a costume, and then you had to guess who it was. So they got George Reeves on, and my father came up with the idea that his costume will be a giant Kent box of cigarettes, like he was inside the Kent box, right? So, so for Mickey Mantle Day, he figured out that he'll have an artist draw a picture of Superman from all the, of Mickey Mantle, and then I would go out on the field and get to present it, as was the custom, people going out and giving him gifts and so on from different organizations, as representative of all these Superman fans. He used to tell me every time we went to a ball game, he said it would take 60 Yankee stadiums to fill up all the people who, read Superman. So he brought it home one night. Wayne Boring, who signed the picture, did the artwork. And when I saw it, I started to cry because I thought it was terrible. And I couldn't see Mickey's number 7 and so on. So my father got so frustrated, he said, forget it. And I ended up keeping it. Now I'm glad that happened.
It's like I said,
and the caption was supposed to read where the ball is going off Superman's hands and bouncing out of the stadium. The caption was supposed to read, not even Superman can catch a ball hit by Supermantle. A similar story. Do you remember the Superman play?
Yes.
On Broadway?
The Broadway play. Yes.
Right. So I'm listening to WABC radio, Cousin Brucey at the time, and they announced on ABC that they're going to have a contest. Whoever can draw the best picture of Superman will get free tickets to the preview of the play. So I tell my father, and he says, don't worry about it. So meanwhile, for those who don't know, the people who wrote the Superman play had just come off doing Bye Bye Birdie, and the book was by the same people who did Bonnie and Clyde. And the producer was Harold Prince, who had just come off Fiddler on the Roof. So it had a lot of power associated with it. And these people were up in my father's office for like 3 weeks, learning the character and questions and so on. So he brings home, he says, here's your entrance. And it was done by Kurt Swan, where you see Superman flying in the background. In the middle, there's a guy sitting on a shack with a fiddle. And in the foreground, there is a guy who looks like Tevye from Fiddler. And the guy on the shack is saying, Tevye, where in the good book does it say a man can fly? And Tevye says, not good book, you fool, comic book. And now it's a Broadway musical. Now you have to realize the artwork, as I said, done by Kurt Swan. So you can't get it any better.
That's true.
And the caption, the idea is by the guy who does this for a living. So my father said, if we don't win, it's a fix. How can this not win? So and at this time, you have to realize I started to believe that I did this. I would take it to school, show my friends, and so on. Mm-hmm. So about 3 days after I send it in, I get a phone call. Is this Hank Weisinger? Yes. Are you over 18? Yes, which I wasn't. And he said, well, you just won 2 free tickets to Superman preview. So my sister and I go, and all the ABC disc jockeys were there. And at halftime, they had a bar set up, and they had all these Superman pictures all over the place by little kids. And right behind the bar was my masterpiece. My only regret was that I didn't get it back. What would that be worth today?
I can only imagine. And I'm like, imagine the producers probably kept that, because I mean, I would certainly hang on to something like that, because
Right.
That's one of those things. Like, as a comics historian, that's the kind of thing that's the kind of thing you love finding out about and would love to see in person. Because what I was going to ask, what did you
and a lot of people, because one of the things that anybody who has read about my father, they know that there are many comments that are not kind, and yet I would say they were all true. That in terms of his staff, he was incredibly abrasive. He would be now, as I went into the corporate world in my own work as a psychologist and seminars on giving and taking criticism and so on. And one of the most frequent questions would be, how do you criticize the abrasive boss? And that's what his staff didn't know how to do. But he was very demanding, hypercritical, abrasive. The attitude was clearly, if you don't like it, leave. Because his only mission was to make Superman successful. Now I believe that when somebody writes a comic, they get credit for it, like the writer's name is on it. That was not going to ever be the case with Superman, because my father wanted Superman to be the star. He did not want the writer or even the editor, for that thing, to be the star. His name didn't appear in the masthead until maybe 15 years after it should have been. And that was a big argument, in that he had to really, fight for that. As many at times as the artists and the writers would say negative things and how he would always fight with them, he also, what they didn't know, he would also fight with the executives about getting them more money. That's what people really, went unnoticed. His whole relationship with DC was always filled in a sense of conflict, which is probably one of the reasons he started to get some, health problems. It was a tremendous sense of pressure. As I tell people, you look at a show like Seinfeld or Bonanza, even Twilight Zone. I've been watching a lot of Twilight Zones lately, and I have to tell you, a lot of them are terrible, absolutely terrible. The difference is there's maybe 15 great episodes that everybody remembers. So when people would say, oh, with Superman, Mort Weisinger, he rehashed stories and so on. Well, Seinfeld did that for 10 years. Whatever story incident happened to George, it happened to Elaine, or it happened to Jerry. And every Bonanza episode, okay, so little Joe falls in love with somebody and they die. Well, then Adam Cartwright falls in love with somebody and they die, and so on. I will tell you that if he was responsible for only one Superman story a week, there never would have been a bad Superman story, ever. So he had to come up with 30 stories a month for 30 years. Obviously, there are going to be rehashes and so on, and covers. I mean, how many times people post, their covers on the Facebook page, and I've seen this, 10 times. He used to call it the switcheroo. And he taught me that as a valuable lesson, to be able to pick a subject, and then when you write about it, be able to come up with 10 or 11, different angles. So I did that with the subject of criticism. For parents, criticizing your kids, sexual criticism at work. He taught me how to get a lot of mileage out of one idea.
Well, we were talking about this. Julie Schwartz, when he introduced the idea of rebooting The Flash for Showcase, Julie had the theory that most kids start reading comic books when they're around 6 or 7 years old, and they start to outgrow it by the time they're 12 or 13. So the lifespan of the average comic reader was maybe 5 to 6 years if you were lucky. But then their little brothers and little sisters or their little cousins start reading comic books. And Julie's idea was that by the time they rebooted The Flash in '56, every kid that would have read the Jay Garrick comics was already outgrown comic books, so they weren't even going to be pitching to them anymore. They were going to be pitching to a brand new audience. So in a lot of ways, your dad's idea that, well, we did, if a story may have been done in like 57, it's okay because the kids who were reading in 57 aren't going to be reading them in 68. I think maybe they might have underestimated the fact that you did have some adult fans that were carrying over, and plus, I don't think any of these guys could have foreseen back issues and reprints and these things being archived today. Back in the day, if you wanted to find a Superman comic book from 2 months ago, it was probably impossible. Nowadays, finding one from 30 years ago, all you have to do is go on Amazon and just collect whatever collection is currently available.
Right. You know, one funny thing about that, do you remember, this might have been before your time, but there was a show called The Loretta Young Show?
It was before my time, but I've seen some episodes, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so one time there was a Loretta Young show where she meets like an artist, and the artist says, "Oh, you're my fantasy," and he shows her a picture, like a portrait of her and so on. And the guy's really a con artist. Anyway, to make a long story short, my father took that and he turned it into a Lois Lane story. So he gets a letter one time from this kid. It says, "Dear editor," he says, "the other night I was watching Loretta Young show, and they had the same story that you had in Lois Lane. They stole your idea." We laughed. The kids saw the rerun of Loretta Young. It was actually just the opposite. So my father wasn't above not taking, borrowing, as he would say it. And yet I found the same idea. People write about the same ideas. That's a big thing in science fiction. You know, who thought of it? And anytime you find something that is good, somebody else will say, "Well, this person wrote the same story, 10 years ago." It's very hard to be original.
Yeah. And you were talking about,
and that was one of my father's things. Every time, like, he would say something to me as a joke and whatever, like, we would play cards every night. This is one of the reasons I was not a great high school student. We played gin and chess till like 2:00 in the morning. And the deal would be, if I won in cards, he'd pay off. But if I lost, I didn't have to pay, because he'd just be taking back his own money anyway. So every time he would get gin, he would say, like, "Ginaroo," and lay down the cards. And then I would say that when I won, and his first comment was, "Can't you be original?"
Well, I did want to address the idea about what you said about your dad. Yeah, I remember reading stories about your dad being your dad, and but again, I always try to put things in the context of history. And I know, like I said, he was coming in at a time when comic books were still considered junk culture. And again, a lot of folks don't understand how close the industry came to shutting down. Really, DC, with Superman and the properties they had, like Bob Hope Comics and Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis Comics, the licenses they were able to get from movie stars and television performers, was one of the things that allowed them to hang on. And then Dell Comics, which was like the only company that actually wouldn't agree to the comics code, because they said, well, Disney is letting us publish stuff, so it's going to be wholesome and family friendly. But there were so many companies that were just barely hanging on. Atlas, I've heard stories about Stan Lee, Martin Goodman coming in and finding like a closet full of artwork from stories they were never going to publish, because Stan didn't have the heart to fire artists, and he was still giving them out assignments even when they knew they didn't have enough books to put all the material out there. So I can understand having this huge property that is basically carrying the entire company. I can imagine that's a lot of pressure on your dad. And again, even if it is, a lot of people are seeing it as junk culture, it has to be the best junk culture out there. And so I can understand you want to strive for excellence. You want to get the best stories you can. You want to get the best artists you can. And something a lot of people don't talk about is the fact that your dad kept a lot of the guys on there. I mean, guys like Kurt Swan, Wayne Boring, he was keeping them on there on the books, and the writers, and giving them assignments. Like you said, he was fighting for them behind the scenes, because I think he knew he had the best guys in the industry at that time.
Yeah, when my father fired Wayne Boring,
Hmm?
Wayne could not believe it. He said, "You're firing me?" And my father's response was, "Do you need a punch in the stomach to tell you that you're not wanted here?"
Wow. Do you know what caused him to fire him?
I mean, my father's fantasy was to get into a debate with Don Rickles.
Wow.
He
Well,
was a master at insulting, but in his eyes, they were always what he called clever insults.
yeah. Well, I did want to ask. You brought up the I Love Lucy episode. What can you tell us about that? About how that came about? Because that's the first time I'm hearing that that your dad was involved with that.
Yep, Lucy was was like one of the top shows.
Mm-hmm.
Superman was flying high, and as I said, he was in charge of public relations. So he knew some people, from the Superman TV show, and made contacts and so on, and came up with the idea of having Superman be at little Ricky's birthday party. And that was a big, that was a very popular show, that episode.
Well, I was gonna say for folks, hopefully there are folks out there who do know I Love Lucy, but folks who do not, that was one of the first shows that really broke down barriers, I think, for Hollywood. I know at the time there were actors that they were said, well, if you do television, we're not going to let you do movies because they thought television was going to kill the film industry. Yeah, but that was the first one. I remember the Hollywood episodes they did, and you had these huge stars like William Holden and Rock Hudson
Right.
and Cornell Wilde, and that kind of opened the door and saying, well, yes, you can be John Wayne and do an I Love Lucy episode and still be a movie star. And I always thought it was kind of great.
Superman was bigger than all of them.
Yeah. Well, I always thought it was great that he was like the last. I think he was like the last major guest they had on the show.
Yeah.
Because it's before they did the whole moving to Connecticut thing, and then the last season and all. So.
Right. Meeting George Reeves was a big thrill. It still is very clear in my mind how he picked me up. He picked me up and he threw me in the air and caught me.
I was going to ask if you ever had a chance to meet any of the cast members. So you did get a chance to meet George.
I lived in California. It must have been about 1955. And we stayed at a hotel in Westwood that was called the Dracker Hotel. The highlight of the day would be my mother taking me to Thrifty Drugstore. They had a counter, and getting my chocolate ice cream soda. And my father would take me to the set. And I remember being disappointed because I was there a whole day but never saw him in his Superman costume. All I saw was the same scene in his Clark Kent talking to Perry White, over and over and over. And I got to meet Noel Neill and Jack Larson. Noel Neill was really nice. I liked her a lot. She later went on the lecture circuit to, make some bucks.
I was going to say, Noel.
When George Reeves committed suicide, I always remember the headline. My father told me he didn't commit suicide. He went back to Krypton.
But how old were you when George died?
I was in 6th grade.
I remember reading all these stories about kids waking up and seeing the headlines because
his girlfriend, who ironically had an LL name. I think her name was Linda Lenore or something.
Lenore Lemon, yeah.
Yeah, was spreading it around Hollywood that he was not a Superman. And that got to him. Regardless of what you saw in that Hollywood movie or whatever. That was one of the reasons. And he was typecast. Yeah. He couldn't get, because anything he would want to do. Remember he was in From Here to Eternity and Gone with the Wind. And he wouldn't be able to get a job. This was one of the things that Sean Connery, for the same reason, stopped doing James Bond.
Well, I was going to say, I remember reading, there's a great book out called Hollywood Kryptonite that explores what happened with him. And I know there's a lot of theories. There is a theory about him committing suicide, and then there's also the theory about having spurned the ex-lover and everything. And
Mhm.
I know, and it's one of those things that even to this day, there's still questions that are about it, because, like I said, there are some folks that believe he killed himself, and other folks thought he was executed for crossing the wrong person. It's really a shame, because, like I said, I mean, for George, I was telling some friends earlier that my parents, we didn't go to the movies when I was a kid. So Christopher Reeve, I didn't really discover until I was like 10 or 11 years old. So for me, George and Danny Dark from the Super Friends that was my Superman when I was a kid, because I remember watching
Mhm.
the episodes and all. But it's wonderful you got a chance to meet him, because I heard he always had a great reputation with kids. He was always very friendly with children.
Yeah.
And I remember reading.
Yeah, he was discovered on the beach for Superman, and it was like it was described as he coming right out of the comic book.
I remember Kurt Swan for several years drawing him in the '50s, especially drawing him like George. And then when Christopher Reeve came out, that's when they started making him more look like Christopher Reeve from the movie and all. So,
Mhm.
but no, he was definitely the Superman for so many people, and for a lot of folks.
Mhm.
Well, I was going to say, I'm looking at the time, and we were wanting to try to wrap up about 12:45, but I wanted to open up the floor to anybody that may have some questions. I was going to say, we've got everybody on mute, but if you guys want to use your chat feature, if you have any questions for us, by all means, please send them in the chat, and I'll be happy to pass them along, and we can do that for a little bit. In the meantime, I did want to ask you, we were talking a little bit, you said that your dad was constantly waking you up in the morning to ask you questions and such about the comics, giving your opinion. You told me that you thought the book started declining when you went to college, and he didn't have you there for his Idea Man, right?
Correct. And at that time, he was starting to get burned out. He had just written a novel, that was called The Contest, which is about Miss America, and he had other aspirations. You know, one of his things, if you remember, I think I mailed it to you, the Superman cover where Clark is walking out on Superman and get yourself a new identity, I'm sick of this, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
That was exactly how he was feeling.
Well, we were talking also about, you said that folks you'd go on vacation and within minutes people would know who your dad was, because he was very proud of being the Superman editor.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it was a sense of being proud. He knew it would impress other people. It'd lead to perks. He lost his wallet one time at the Little Neck Theater in Long Island, and the owner found it. And when he was looking to see who it belonged, he came across his business card. And from that point on, every movie we went to see at that theater, we got in for free.
Wow. Well, I'll be honest. I can't blame your dad for being proud. It's like I said, if I was editing Superman or writing Superman, I'd have T-shirts made up going, "I write Superman," and I'd make up T-shirts saying, "I met the guy who writes or edits Superman," and pass them out.
It was great in terms of when we used to get into debates of whose father had the better job or the most status, because nobody could respond after I said, "Well, my father's the editor of Superman."
Yeah.
That was a lot better than saying my father's a cardiovascular surgeon. Who cares when you're 10 years old?
That's true. Well, I was going to say, how did other kids react when they found out who your dad was?
They loved it. I mean, the best thing, I went to camp once and I hated it. The idea of waking up to a bugle at 7:30 and making my own bed was incomprehensible to me. And the only good thing was, you know, they'd have a canteen in camp. My father would be sending me like 20 comics every week. So I had no interest in these comics. So I would then be able to trade for, their canteen tickets, so I could get like candy and stuff like that. I was like the Godfather. I controlled the comic industry at summer camp.
I was going to say, you must be like the kid whose dad ran the candy store. It's like getting candy meant that was nothing. I mean, you got that all the time. Yeah. So
every night he would come home with, the latest comics. Why would I read social studies? There was no point in that. It was like after dinner, I'd go up and I'd read, and then my father would come in and say, and all these stories, you have to remember, I heard. So when I would see it come to print, it was like seeing the vision realized.
I can imagine that scene is like, are you reading the comic books or you're doing your homework? I'm reading the comic book, Dad. I'm reading it right now. It's like, you're doing your homework, aren't you? It's like, no, I'm reading the comic book, honestly. Read those comic books.
You know how when you go to the library and you're looking like a journal article or an old magazine and they have it bounded, they have like every year, like here are all the magazines from 1940 to 1941 and so on. Well, he used to bring home from every year the bounded Superman comics. Like they were volumes, like a year. Each one would have a year. And he wrote an article on refrigerators. So the guy gave him a free refrigerator for the publicity. It was like a mini refrigerator that he would keep in his home office. There was no food in it. It was stuffed with comics, and so on. There was nowhere else to put them. And I only wish that I had kept those volumes now, because they'd be worth millions and millions of dollars.
Well, we do have a question from Christopher Butson. Hank, did your father ever discuss any ways Judaism, or being the son of immigrants, influenced his work as the Superman editor?
How Judaism?
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, because Superman couldn't get circumcised.
I remember. I think Mad Magazine actually addressed that. They had, what if Superman had been raised by Jewish parents, and they actually did address that. So.
Right, that would have been something. No, he would try to keep anything controversial, whether it was like when we were coming into Vietnam, religion, because he didn't want to alienate anybody. So Superman really became, as everybody knows, all inclusive. I think there were many things in strips, where Superman would preach immigrants, we welcome everybody. They had a lot of inclusive Superman ads where he was a spokesman.
Well, I remember there's a famous one that still gets posted on Facebook about anyone, Superman addressing a group of kids, saying that anytime someone says that so and so is not American, they're wrong.
Right.
And
right.
And I think Superman's he's the perfect spokesman for that idea. I mean, he is the American immigrant story.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I can only imagine what he would be writing now in this era. In fact, I have been thinking of doing a open ed thing for around the election time on who would Superman vote for, considering truth, justice, and the American way were the values that I grew up with.
I think actually DC did address that at one time, and as I recall it correctly, Superman said that he knew who he was going to be voting for, but he would not state publicly because he thought that it was every citizen's right to keep it private who you voted for. But at the same time too, he also thought there were so many people that would be influenced by him. He didn't want to influence the election. So
here's something amusing that a couple of months ago, Liz Cheney, she made a statement that I found really offensive because it was, false information. Now she's from Wyoming. Now, when my father died, several universities asked my mother for his papers, and the two that were the most enthusiastic were Syracuse. So she gave a bunch of stuff to Syracuse and the University of Wyoming. So I called up the University of Wyoming and I said, unless Liz Cheney retracts that statement, I will be forced to take the collection back because my father could not stand that. So I called up the biggest newspaper in Wyoming and I said, I think I got a story for you. And I told them what I was doing. Well, later that day, it was on the front page of the Wyoming newspaper, and then it went viral. The New York Times picked it up, Washington Post, the Detroit Free Press You know, and if somebody says, if you Google like Superman and Liz Cheney, that will come up. I never had any desire to take the papers back anyway. I didn't want them. In fact, I'm glad my mother did that, because I can just see he had all the volumes, all the editions of Wonder Stories, you know, Startling Stories, all those science fiction pulp magazines, and they were literally in mint condition. And I am really glad now that I don't have them, because I never would have taken care of them. So I'm glad they're in universities where people can, you know, study them.
I was gonna ask, did they also
And that's where the idea of the bug-eyed monsters came.
Yeah.
EEMs, as they used to call them. And that's where he really got in the idea of the cover sells the story. First come up with the cover, and then we'll do a story around it. The cover was the most important thing to him.
Right. I was going to ask, the papers that your dad had, these including like early correspondence he had like with Julie Schwartz and like with Jerry Siegel and such, back when they were fans.
Yeah, he's got a lot of the correspondence stuff and so on.
Wow.
My sister actually wrote an article on that for Alter Ego about her trip to Wyoming.
Like I said, as a comics historian, that's the kind of stuff I would love to see, because, like I said, it's just it fascinates me to read about the early days of fandom when things were first getting started. And again, we take for granted nowadays being able to come together online like this, but back in the day when the only way you could contact with another fan maybe is by writing them and having to wait days or weeks for correspondence, and you may be that one kid that's growing up in New York City that's waiting for a kid from Cleveland to write you back because you happen to read the same issue of Amazing Stories and liked it, and you found that hidden soul. So in that regards, I think we're definitely living in great times as far as being able to come together. And again, that's part of the whole spirit of this weekend. So, Hank, I was going to say, I just noticed the time. We've reached our end point. We've got to get ready for another meeting coming up in about 10 minutes or so.
Okay.
But Hank,
Well, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it. And if anybody needs to get a hold of me, you have my email. You can just, you know, pass it on.
You got it. And like I said, we want to thank everybody for joining us today. Hank, again, it's an honor and a pleasure to have you with us. And thank you for being our first official guest at the Superman Virtual Days.
Okay.
You take care, my friend.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. And guys, I'm going to go and end the meeting right now. But like I said, we've got a meeting coming up very shortly with the Wade family. We're going to be talking to them about their comic books.
Now.
We got a meeting coming up with the Wade family very shortly. You'll actually be able to see them, and we invite you all to join us. And thank you for tuning in for our first guest of the day. And we wanted to invite you to come back and stick around because, like I said, we got some other great guests coming up today. It's going to be a lot of fun. See you guys.